Morning, everyone. Welcome to a new week, actually a new month. Today is September 1st, and we will begin our new topic for today. Before that, I want to do two quick programming notes again. First, as you can see, there's a new background right behind me. I told you already in the first meeting we had that if you have a favorite background that you like when you are using your own Zoom calls over the last few months or your Zoom lectures that you are attending, you're welcome to send me suggestions. Since so far it has been my responsibility, for today I chose Whitehaven Beach in Eastern Australia. If you had a chance, go there. I was there quite a long time ago, about 15 years ago. It's a beautiful place. Doesn't look exactly like this picture, but it's a very beautiful place. So once the world comes back to reality and you're graduating, I encourage you to go visit Australia. It's a beautiful place. Another thing, I've been tracking the attendance so far in the class, and it seems to be working with the Google Forms. So just make sure that you write all the right information. Make sure that when you provide me with the attendance word, that you provide the word that fits with the right lecture. So if you're backlogging some of the lectures and you're just today watching one of the first or the second one, just make sure that you use the right word in the right date. So it's not going to be any mix-up. Otherwise, it's just going to spend too much time for all of us. But so that's what we have. And let's start. I'll share my screen with you. All right. So today we'll begin talking about some of the main theories in IR with realism and neorealism. But as always, we'll start with a quick review on what we talked the last time. So I finished the discussion about presenting the basics of theory in IR specifically, but basic of theory as a whole, by making most of the discussion about the levels of analysis. The idea that we can study different topics, different issues in political science, in IR, in social science as a whole, using different lenses, just looking at that at different levels of analysis. So overall, based on the Singer paper, I talked about the macro level, focusing on the international system conditions within the international structure, which drive the behavior of the different components, which is the different states. Another one of the important characteristics of the macro system, the international system, is that all the components are seen as the same kind of components, or they're viewed in a homogeneous manner. So all the states, we disregard their internal dynamics, their internal structure. We just look at states as pretty much all of them the same, and view the system as driving the behavior. So that was the macro level. The micro level is the nation state, looking at the inside of states and how the internal dynamics might shape also the behavior of the actor itself within the international system. I talked about the benefits and costs in each one of them. Singer emphasized mostly the nation state approach as providing much more rich in details and providing us multiple explanations for the same phenomena. Even within the same level of analysis, we can think about the nation state, different institution or factor within the state that might drive the outcome. So that's part of the reasoning for justifying the richer argument that a micro level of analysis offers us. In the second half of the lecture, I talked about the application of theories, political science theories, and how we apply them in reality, mostly revolving around the AV and Dish paper. And they surveyed the policymakers and try to compare what exactly do policymakers value and what exactly scholars are more likely to produce. And you saw the pretty clear gap that exists. Policymakers highly value the historical cases, the specific cases, to provide them specific context for their questions, which are policy focusing. On the other hand, scholars will mostly looking to generate general explanations about behavior in the international system, are focusing on using a much more quantitative methods in order to test as many possible general hypotheses and explanation as possible. So this is what's this gap that exists. And then we talked a little bit also about the Byman and Cronin paper, which offers a few ways to bridge or address that gap and close it down a bit. And this is an issue which is still in discussion every day. When we are producing our own research, we're hoping that in some level is going to get noticed and being used by policymakers. So that's part of the problems that we have to solve and the problem that they have to address. And that's how we're fighting to try and close that gap as much as possible. And I talked a little bit about your survey responses and everybody that they replied to the survey and what you had overall. You already have the updated syllabi with the dates on eCampus, all the dates to submit the different tasks, the midterm task, the final task. The date to approve the final task topic with me is also on the syllabi. So if you have any additional questions, you're more than welcome to send them to me. At some point next week, I will provide more details regarding the midterm task, what exactly is expected of you. And you will also get, I'm not sure it's going to be next week, it's going to be possibly the following week, the second survey, so the second task. But we'll get to that and we'll talk about it. If you have any additional questions, you're more than welcome, of course, to email them to me. And that's it. Let's move on. So today we begin talking about some of the main theories in IR. Overall, scholars, when they talk about those theories, they view theories as important in playing the role of organizing principles of our knowledge. So we have a lot of knowledge regarding the international system, and we're using those theories in order to organize that knowledge. All right, so we'll talk first about the realist theory. I'll talk a little bit about the background of the theory, mostly talking about its core principle to help us understand exactly what is the foundations and what the theory, what's the best way that the theory uses to explain behavior in the international system, and also meant some of the potential problems. And we'll get to that also when we get to the additional theory we'll talk today. So realism emphasizes the enduring propensity of states for engaging in conflict. The most dominant view developed during the early years of the Cold War in the late 1940s. The first manifestation of the theory was introduced in 1949 in a famous book by Morgenthau, which I will talk about today. It was dominant during the height of the Cold War all the way through the late 1970s, late 1980s. It has an application today. We'll get to today a little bit later. The main reason that it was so dominant was it was simple. It provided a very powerful explanation for a lot of phenomena that was very common during that time, during the Cold War, whether it is just war between different states, the structure of alliances within the international system, the imperialism or the end of imperialism during that time. It provided a lot of explanations for all those things. So it was simple, and it provided that. It was an approach which emphasized the struggle for power and the conflicts within the international system, which also offers a pretty much pessimistic view about the prospects of eliminating this idea of war. As I said, it was introduced by Morgenthau in a 1949 famous book, which since then has came out in additional versions. I think there's like version 10 or something up to today. The theory of realism is based on 6 core principles, which I will talk about in a few seconds. It describes its role both as a theory, again, as an organizing principle of knowledge within international relations, then some of the more specific factors which relate to how theory explains the behavior of states in the international system, and additional factors. The final point is, there it is. Let's go back to our last point when we talk about theory construction, and that's the level of analysis question. So this is a structural system theory which uses a set of simplifying assumptions in order to explain reality and explain the interaction between the different components, between the different actors in the international system. So it's a system theory. The behavior of the states is based on the way the system is built, and we'll get to that. All states are viewed, again, seen as similar to one another. Okay, so the first set of principle addresses the basics of realism as in theory of international relations. According to realism, international politics is governed by objective laws that are based on human nature. The theory adopts a rational decision-making approach, according to which, first of all, the laws that define the international politics are objective. And decision makers face different kinds of choices they have to make in the context of foreign policy, so they have to weigh the cost and benefits of the choice. So again, it's following a very clear rational decision-making model. Similar to humans, according to the realism theory, state has an innate desire to dominate other, which in the context of international relations leads to conflict. How exactly, I'm getting to that in a second, but that's the basic foundations of how the realism as a theory is intended to explain international relations, using, again, as an organizing principle to explain behavior in this context. All right, let's get to the main principles. The next set of principles explain more in detail what are the main factors that make realism a framework to explain international behavior in the international system. So the main driver of behavior is the concept of power. Power drives the behavior of states in the international state. Power is under the concept of interest. So states have different interests they're trying to pursue, and those interests are defined in terms of powers. So all the actions of states are intended to accomplish some interest, and all those interests, according to the realist theory, are defined in terms of power. The assumption of one of the assumptions of the theory is that statesmen think in terms of power, so they are trying to pursue power, and there's some historical evidence to support that argument. In addition, using the concept of power to define the interest makes this theory different from other theories in international relations, in social science as a whole. Again, politics in that sense is different from other disciplines because we define the interest of the actors within the system in terms of power. This kind of view of focusing on the power provides us a very general term or general concept to focus the theory around, and allows us to study the behavior of every actor in the international system in a very systematic manner. It's going to be a consistent theory, which does not lend itself to any kind of internal elements within the state, such as ideologies, motives, or stuff like that. So that's the first principles related to power as defining the theory and the actions in the international system. Few more points regarding the power. That's an additional principle. Power as defining the interest of states is a universal concept. It is objective, and it can have multiple meanings. What exactly does it mean to have multiple meanings? So power can be either physical power, using physical violence in overpowering others within actors in the system, of course, or it can be also psychological aspects of power within the relationship or within the interaction within the state. Additionally, it can be power in the sense of organized power instituted by democratic or non-democratic states, for that matter. It can also be uncontrolled force, so an uncontrolled setting, not necessarily a state which implements the use of power. So there's going to be multiple meanings for the use of power, but this is the most fundamental principle of behavior in the international system according to the realist theory. The next set of principles are moving away from the foundations of power as a realist and address other issues related to international behavior in the international system. So that focusing mostly around different moral consideration. According to Morgenthau, realism figures and accepts the idea that there are moral values to any kind of political action. Also, there is a constant tension between the moral command of an action and the requirement in order to make a successful political action. So in many cases, in order to implement a political policy, in many cases it has moral implications which are not that positive. So realism understands that there is tension in this case. The main argument that the theory proposes in this context is that moral principles can be introduced to the behavior state, but that has to be universal moral principles. So state cannot design their behavior based on any kind of individual moral principle, but they have to be more of a moral principle related to the system as a whole. So as an example, both universal and an individual moral principle can be a principle such as liberty, for that matter. But according to the realist point of view, the state cannot sacrifice its aspiration for a universal moral principle of survival in order to satisfy an individual moral principle such as liberty. So that's what it means to make sure that the universal aspect of the moral value is more important than the individual moral principle. Again, the fifth principle pretty much says the same thing overall. The political realism refuses to identify the moral principles, moral aspirations of particular nations within the moral laws that govern the entire government. So even if you look at specific states and they have their own moral principles, they cannot be more important than the universal moral laws that govern the system. So the specific considerations or aspirations of nations cannot be the guide to the way that the system operates. Finally, the last principle is a more general one. Morgenthau presents this principle as how the realism is a very unique approach and different than other schools of thought, mostly because the focus on power, the principle of power, provides us an autonomous and a general view of the world, allow us to study the world in the more general view, look at the entire interactions between different actors and explain their behavior. That's what makes this approach unique and different than approaches that rely on looking at specific countries, looking at specific leaders, looking at specific cases. So again, it's the idea of providing a framework of studying international relations using a very general view. So the next important part of realism in this case is how is the system, the international system, organized? And the number one concept that we use in this case is what's called the balance of power. So what you have here is an illustration from the beginning of the 20th century that represents the balance of power of the interactions between the different states, most of them in Europe, right before the start of the First World War. On the one hand, we have a set of states which included both France and Great Britain, also had the Netherlands and Belgium. You see all this cluster of gentlemen here on the right-hand side. On the other hand were Germany and Austro-Hungary, which was the Austrian-Hungary Empire. Today it includes the two states of Austria and Hungary in Eastern Europe. That was before the First World War. And in the middle here you have Italy. We'll get to, in a few minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about the configuration of power in Europe right before the Cold War, because that's related to this whole idea of balance of power. But the idea behind this picture is to illustrate the idea that there is counter or contrasting forces on each side of those interactions between states. So let's talk about it a little bit more. So the structure of the global system is the balance of power. That's the BOP. According to the realist theory, it is an essential factor which is important to stabilize what's called the society of sovereign nations, so the international system. It works to preserve the stability without destroying what's called the multiplicity of elements of compromise the system, which is a point which shows exactly why this is a structural theory. What does that mean? The system ensures the stability of the international structure of balance of power, ensures the stability of the system, but it also preserves the composition of the system, of the different components of the system. So it recognizes the existence of different actors within the system, so that's the different nation states, but it emphasizes the structural goal of stability and predictability and avoiding conflicts based on this dynamic of balance of power. Now, how exactly is balance of power operates? What's the idea behind that? Let's use another picture. This is not balance of power in reality in the 20th century, but this is just to illustrate a little bit how that works. The idea behind balance of power is if we have three different states, A, B, and C, let's call them, and they all compete for power. Reminding you again, the most basic fundamental principle of realism is that states compete for power. Now, if state A wants to expand its power, expand its control by trying to get some of its control over state C for that matter, then state B will balance against it, challenge it, in order, and will prevent it from state A gaining more power. Now, state B can do that by coming together along with state C against state A. That's one option, and we'll talk in a second. I'll show you exactly the different methods in order to actually implement this balance of power. In addition, state B can just counter state A in this imaginary relationship that I present you here. And it also makes sure that state C, in that case, remains independent from pressure from either state A or state B. So after all this very abstract example, but again, it's based on the idea of balancing the power of all the actors within the system, we can talk about the different balancing methods. So one of them is what's called an arms race. So if we had our example of states A, B, and C, so state B, which wants to balance the power of state A, which tries to expand its power, can just increase its military power in order to balance the rival. Get into an arms race, get more military power, increase its military power, and balance the growing power of the first state, in this case, state A. Another option is to form an alliance. So in this case, state B will join with, in my example, it was state C, and they will form an alliance that is based on a shared objective, strategic objective. It also makes sense if our hypothetical world includes more than just A, B, and C, that state A will also form an alliance with her own actors that share the same strategic objective. So again, the idea is that alliances are formed based on strategic objective, and they are intended to balance each other. Now, since alliances are a very important element in the vast majority of material-based theories, such as realism, and we'll talk also a little bit in a few minutes also about neorealism, I want to mention a few more points in that context. So alliances are more likely to form when nations view this arrangement as practical. Their motivation overall is to extend their own power, just like as I provided the example here. If state A wants to expand its own power, it can form an alliance and then try to expand, the alliance will try to expand its own control, but then the rivals will also form their alliance in order to also extend their own power. That's the motivation. That will only be formed if that's going to be a practical, if it's not going to be too costly, especially for the more powerful nations within those kinds of arrangements. So if a strong nation like B, for that matter, in our example, forms an alliance with a weaker nation such as nation C, they will be part of that alliance, and state B might leave the alliance if it feels secure enough in its own power, or if the commitment to the alliance might be too costly. So that's the reason. So it's a very practical, and that comes back also to the basic foundations of realist theory. You're thinking about it in the context of rational choice. If the costs are just too high, it doesn't make sense to maintain the alliance, and the country is most likely to leave the alliance. The distribution of the benefits within the alliance, so what benefits each one of the actors get from this alliance, is most likely to reflect the distribution of power within the alliance. Okay, let's think about a few examples. I already gave you pretty much the example from Europe, but let's stick with it for a minute. The person that introduced realism, as I told you, his name was Morgenthau. He wrote the book in the late 1940s, and he argued that the global system until 1914 presents a balanced and stable system which focused on the idea of realism and the balance of power. The way that this global system was defined was called a multipolar system because there were many different poles that illustrated the way that the international system was built. So there was Germany that was rising at some point, and there was France as a pole, and there was Britain, and all of them had different arrangement between one another in order to balance one another. That's one example that I gave you a little bit earlier, and we'll get to that when we talk about the additional theory. We'll also address this example of the way that the international system was built before 1914. We'll get to that, but again, this is described, I'll give you the term again, it's called multipolarity because there's multiple poles coming to play. Even though that in the case of 1914, sometimes you got eventually two, you had Britain and France and Russia on one hand and Germany and this on the other hand, that was very close to the war. The idea that Morgenthau was presented that the multipolar world was an example of the international system from the around the late 17th century all the way till 1914. So there's multiple poles that were dominant in the system. We can also use the realist framework to explain interactions between, not just between state, but between societal groups. So it's not exactly applying it right away the way that Morgenthau did. This is a more contemporary way to apply this dynamics, but the logic is the same. So let's think about it in the context of ethnic group tension. So according to one study, a breakup of multi-ethnic states can go through the same power dynamics such as the realist theory proposes and lead to those kinds of rising tensions and potentially a conflict. Because once the state itself breaks up, there's multi-groups which again compete to have their own power. So it creates the same structure such as the international system according to the way that the realist theory explains the international system. And each state will try to expand its own power and try to use force in order to improve its relative position. Now, the risks are even higher for conflict and for casualties if there are minorities in territory which are disputed between those different groups. So if there's minorities in one area of one ethnic group and there's another ethnic group who tries to control that area, then there's risk to these minorities. They might be the victims of violence in this case. The example that is given to that is the situation that happens in Yugoslavia and the crisis in the Balkans, actually throughout the 1990s, following the end of the Cold War, when the Yugoslavian country was broken up and there was a lot of multi-ethnic groups in that area. It led to the creation of multiple states eventually today, which includes today Serbia and Croatia and a few other countries. So this is not exactly an application of realism in the context the way that Morgenthau displayed it, the classic realism application, but it's the same dynamic in the struggle for power, and that's how that might lead to conflict under certain structural situation that is the same. So just to end the discussion about realism, according to some of the proponents of the theory, it's still a central framework to explain international relations today, mostly because many states still pay attention to the balance of power and worry about the possibility of major conflicts. Some argue that this is part of the explanation of why countries in East Asia, such as South Korea, for example, or in Eastern Europe, are very much fighting to preserve and expand the presence of the United States military or the influence in the United States in their regions in order, again, to balance the growing power of other poles such as Russia in Eastern Europe or China in Eastern Asia for that matter. So that's on some level explain that. Okay, so realism is the first what's called material theory of international relations that we have talked about. And now I will move to additional one, which doesn't have a very sophisticated name. It's just called neorealism, and which may lead us to think, is this just realism 2.0? Well, the neorealist view is an advanced version, in a way, of the classic realism approach. It was introduced by a scholar named Kenneth Waltz in 1979 in a very famous book. Overall, it's adjusts the realist views by placing a lot more emphasis on the international system, on the structure, as the main, in a way, factor that drives the behavior. The classic realism says the state behave based on the way that things operate in the international system. The neorealist approach places a lot more emphasis on the role of the international system, of the structure in which those different states are part of, and how that actually drives their behavior. The theory has 4 core assumptions, which I will get to in a second. They intended to also accomplish this role of further clarify the role of the international system as determining the behavior of the different actors. So it's not their internal affair, it's the characteristics of the system. According to Waltz, using those assumptions, again, is simplifying the reality that he describes, provides a reasonable trade-off in order to ensure the parsimony, reminding you again the principle of parsimony when we are constructing general theories. You lose some of the accuracy according to that, of course, but according to the way that he described the international system, this is a fair trade-off. And it's a trade-off that always exists when we try to build general theories in social sciences. And it's also always a question of how much are you willing to accept less accuracy in favor of more parsimony, or exactly the opposite. So let's talk about those assumptions. The first and most important assumption, according to the neorealist theory, which is also a basic assumption in realism, just less emphasized in that context, the international system is defined based on a state of anarchy, which means that there is no one world government, there's no supranational authority that enforces the agreements between states. So if for that matter, if now Belgium and, I don't know, Croatia go into an agreement, there's no one world government, European government, that's going to enforce those two countries to accept that agreement. They have to accept them. So that's actually a state of anarchy. Nobody can enforce those international agreement or rules for that matter. So the only thing that prevails for the different actors within the system is their own self-interest, their own self-help. The second assumption sees the states as the primary actors in international politics. Similar to realism, it again places an even much more emphasis on the idea of states as unitary actor. I remind you again, I gave you the example of what is unitary actor is. All states are the same, and the state has one voice. It doesn't matter if there's all kinds of things happening internally within those states. They have one voice, and that's all that matters. And that, again, another principle, another assumption in this case, intended to enhance the idea of using a structural framework to explain the relationship and the behavior in the states. The third assumption is a very important one. According to neorealist theory, states are seeking first and foremost to maximize their security. And all other factors, all other kinds of objective interest only come after the security of the state is ensured. And one of the things that might be pretty clear, that's one of the clearest differences between a realist theory and a neorealist theory. Neorealism emphasizes security, while realism emphasizes power. So those are two concepts that each one of those theories emphasize. Now, neorealism also addressed the idea of power, but according to Waltz's argument, states will try to increase their own power only if it does not represent a risk to their security. So again, the primary objective is to maximize, to enhance their security. If they feel secure enough, then they may try to increase their own power. Those are the assumptions. As you can see, when you address and you go through those 4 assumptions, they pretty much cover the idea of enhancing the effects of the international system on the behavior of state. Because of the anarchy, everything actually has to happen. And the focus of the states, again, is security and not power. It's first of all to ensure their own survival in this self-help anarchic system, and only then enhance their power. So how does the international system operate based on the theory of neorealism? According to Waltz, there are a number of great powers within the international system, all seeking to ensure their survival, to ensure their security, rather to expand their power. Because the system is anarchic, this is one of the important characteristics of the system, then it compels each actor, each nation within this system to rely only on itself to ensure its own survival. And that's good for the great powers. What happens with the weaker powers? So the weak states, in this case, need help. But unlike the arguments raised by the realist approach, as offered by Morgenthau, the weaker states will not bandwagon, which means the weak states will be joined by stronger states in order to ensure their own power or survival. In this case, they will actually balance against powerful nations. And that's going to create a different structure of the system based on those dynamics. The neorealism, when it was first introduced, was seen on some levels. Some termed it and some viewed it as what's called a defensive realism. So the earlier version of neorealism, which was introduced in the late 1970s, early 1980s, was seen as a defensive version of realism. You can think about it, it makes a lot of sense. The focus on security instead of focusing on power, just by that, make sure that this is a more of a defensive stance. So the idea behind that is that both weak states and great powers will seek their survival. They will form balancing alliances, pretty similar to realism, but again, the focus in this case is not to expand their power, but actually is to ensure their own survival. Those balancing alliances will rely on different defensive postures. So for example, because the theory was mostly developed during the latter stage of the Cold War, so nuclear weapons were a prominent factor in that stage, and the strategy of MAD, remember I talked about that in Thursday's lecture, the mature mutual assured destruction that the two superpowers faced during the Cold War. The idea is that we have those retaliatory nuclear forces as defensive postures to ensure our own survival and to make sure that we are secured. Now, an important framework or theory that actually the defensive realism and the defensive stance of neorealism is lied on is what's called the offensive-defensive balance theory. The offensive-defensive balance theory explains the incentive for states' behavior based on the ratio that we have between offensive strategy and offensive tools versus defensive strategy and defensive tools. So I'm not going to go too much into details about that. It's just the foundation in order to understand the logic of the defensive stance of neorealism. But according to, if we join those two theories together, when defensive strategy, defensive tools is easier to implement, then there's less incentives for states to behave in aggressive manner. Security is expanded throughout the system. Again, when the defensive tools are easier to implement, and nuclear weapons on some level provides as an example, because once you have this retaliatory nuclear forces, you have easier way to defend yourself from a conceptual standpoint. In addition, in this kind of situation, it's easier for the different actors to distinguish between defensive and offensive weapons, and they can secure themselves without the emergence of additional threats, and that's going to reduce the extent of anarchy in the system. Okay, you don't have to go into an intense arms race in order to expand your offensive capabilities, because defensive posture is easier. So again, that first of all, it makes the system a lot clearer in terms of the interactions and relations between the different actors. It also makes the system and the extent of anarchy less of a prominent issue. I want to talk about a few more specific elements of neorealism as a theory, also how it is distinguished from the realist. It's a realist father or cousin, whatever you want to call that. So the neorealist theory, one of the important things that Waltz was trying to promote, this is what's called a reductionist approach. It's a very general explanation for a framework to explain international politics. It places very little value in specific details, such as the internal dynamics of different states. That's why it's reductionist, because it does not place too much value. It does not pay too much attention to the internal aspects of different states. Now, this is the same idea was also in realism, but again, in the way that Waltz described the theory, it has to be a lot more important as the basic foundations of the theory. We can view that while realism, I remind you again some of the arguments that we talked about, that realism views states as kind of a black boxes or this billiard ball view of states. It explains the behavior of those states using the general incentive. In the case of realism, it was power. Neorealism, if you want to think about it, is more of a reductionist theory. It's even more of the 40,000 feet view. The structure itself, the anarchy of the anarchy that the international system is experiencing, that's what drives the behavior of state. That's why it's a lot more of a reductionist theory than realism is. Again, the main distinction between the neo-realist and the realist view is the focus on security. That means that when we think about power, we think about it with the neo-realist approach, we think about it in relative sense. So the accumulation of power, one of the reasons that neo-realism is less emphasizing power, because the accumulation of power is useless if other states also accumulate power, because then in a relative sense, you actually gain nothing. Because if state A now got more power, but state B also got more power as part of the idea behind balance of power, then in essence, state A didn't get any relative more power than state B. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to use the concept of power. The emphasis on security also means emphasis on a policy which is prudent in order to reduce the risks of conflict and war, again, because the focus is security. This focus on security has an additional implication. That means, now you see that, cooperation in the long term is not very likely. It's not likely to be a successful long-term policy, mostly because the different, again, based on this anarchy structure of the system, states can only trust themselves. So cannot necessarily over a long period of time trust other states that they'll be able to sustain this cooperation. And that has a direct implication in the context of alliances. Alliances will be short-lived as states will weigh the relative gains and losses in those settings. And when the loss is going to be too high, they're just going to desert the alliance and break it up. So states will, again, emphasize their own security and will not trust others. So coming back to the idea of how the system structure looks like, I remind you again, when I talked about the realist approach, then it was the balance of power, how different states will come to balance against one another in a structure which involves different actors. Within the context of neorealism, this is a much clearer illustration of the way it was. It's a bipolar system because there's two large poles which characterize the system. Most states are organized in those two large blocks, and each one of those blocks will be led by a dominant power. Why? Because they try, again, to emphasize their own security. It's not a search for power, it's a search for security. So during the Cold War, which was the height of the Cold War, which was the main illustration of the times that the neo-realist approach was most dominant, it was one pole led by the United States, including most of the NATO states, Western Europe, those kinds of actors. On the other hand, was a pole led by the Soviet Union and its own satellite states and its own allies in Eastern Europe. So that was the main structure of the system throughout that time. Again, some of the ideas behind neorealism, because it's a very simple structure of the system, it increases the predictability of the actions of the state, and it increases the security of the different actors within the states and its stability. Before I move on to the last couple of things that I want to talk about, I will stop for today's attendance word while you have this nice Uncle Sam and Brown and Russian bear in the background. So the attendance word for today will be backpack. Backpack is our attendance word. Do not forget to send it after you're done watching today's lecture. Okay, I want to finish today's lecture by, again, coming back to the realist and neorealist approach and illustrate them with real world cases, and not only illustrate them, but try to compare and contrast them one against another. So one way to do that, the principle that we use in order to compare those two theories, is look at the dynamic of the interaction between the states. So for example, let's look at the balance of power structure. As I told you, I gave you the example of the balance of power structure before, the different military commitments, before 9/11. So this will give you a sense of the different treaties and commitments that the different states in Europe, the main states in Europe, had. So on the one hand, Russia and the Great Britain and France had their own defense pact and military commitments with one another. They also had some agreements that they forged with Italy, which at the first stages of the war was actually a neutral state. On the other hand, we had Germany and Austro-Hungary. But what you can see here is that there is this connection between those two. In this case, it's two poles. It can be more. You can view that as multiple poles, not necessarily just two poles. But this is two arrangements of alliances right before the First World War began. And we can see that there's, because of this, the way that Italy stands here as related to both of those alliance structures, there is a lot more uncertainty and less predictability. And eventually, the war, one of the important things that led to the beginning of the war is the clash of Russia on the one hand and Austro-Hungary on the other hand over Serbia, which then in additional dynamics led to the war. So the argument in this case, when we look at the realist structure of the world, is it's a lot less certain, and there's the possibility, mostly because of those different alliance commitments, which it doesn't necessarily have to be separated into two blocks. We compare that to the structure of the international system during most of the Cold War. This is the view of the world in 1989. You can see no connection between those two poles. On the one hand, you had the NATO countries led by the United States, also with Germany, Britain, France, and a few other Western European nations. On the other hand, we had the Soviet Union or Russia with the Warsaw Pact members, which were the different countries mostly in Eastern Europe. So there's a lot more predictability and clarity regarding the system. No cross ties. You can argue that when we compare the neorealist and the realist, there's a lot more certainty and predictability in the bipolar system compared to the multipolar system. But there's other ways we can compare those two things. For example, we can think about these questions of not just the stability of the system, also the longevity. How long does this structure survive? Now, the realist structure, the balance of power structure, is an illustration of the international system since the Westphalian Peace way back in the 17th century, 1648, which held pretty much for over 200 years until the beginning of the First World War. So the multipolar structure had much longer duration in this case, because when we think about the bipolar structure structure held from 1945, the end of the second World War, up until the end of the Cold War and the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1989. So in terms of longevity, the multipolar structure held much longer. Now, just to complete the presentation of times until today, so the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, were mostly characterized as a unipolar system because the United States rose to prominence as the main great power leading the world. And there's a lot of things to read about that, but I'm not going to talk into unipolarity today. This was the 1990s, the early 2000s. Since the mid 2000s until at some point today, some argue that we came back on some level to a multipolar structure because we have the United States on the one hand, we have Russia rising in Europe on the other hand, we have the Western Europe countries, which also represent some kind of pole, and of course China in the Far East as an additional pole. So there's today much more. There's much more similarity to a multipolar structure compared to a bipolar structure that we had during the Cold War. Now, so if we use this this principle to compare those two different systems, you can say that in terms of stability, in terms of longevity and overall stability of the structure, the multipolar structure is a much more powerful because it held for much longer. At the same time, proponents of the Neorealist theory are likely to argue that while the multipolar system held, you know, as much longer in terms of just the longevity of the system, much longer time, there was a lot of instability within the system. There was constant conflict within different members of the system, whether it is the wars between France and Germany in the early 19th century, or even wars between the United States and Britain in the latter part of that era. So while it held for longer, according to the neorealist proponents of the international system, it was not stable. It had a lot of conflict. So it doesn't necessarily represent a stable system, which is better for that or not. An additional principle, we can focus just on the wars themselves. Look at the number of wars, the length of the wars between the main powers that comprise the system. So the bipolar system during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, there were no direct clashes between the superpowers. The only semi-clash between a superpower and an aspiring superpower at the time was the US-China clashes during the Korean War, which were not insignificant, of course, but again, based on the way that the neorealist theory describes the world, this is not a direct clash between the superpowers which comprise the system. At the same time, there were numerous and many indirect conflict and different types of proxy wars between the two superpowers throughout the Cold War and in multiple regions throughout the globe. So there were conflicts in the Middle East during that time, which of course the superpowers, the United States and the Russians on the other hand, each one of them took sides throughout the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1950s for that matter. There were multiple conflicts in East Asia, including the war in Korea, of course, the war in Vietnam, and conflicts throughout East Asia, and of course, conflicts throughout East Europe. Everything that happened in Hungary and in Czechoslovakia during those years were, in a way, indirect conflicts between the two superpowers. So there was a lot of conflict between them, even though we did not have a direct conflict between the two major powers. If we now look at the multipolar system as was offered by the realist approach, so there's also evidence for a confrontation between the main powers in the system, as I said, Germany and France, and Germany and Britain, all that kind of confrontation throughout that time. But also at the same time, we had relatively long peaceful period, which lasted anywhere between 40 and 50 years. So that's another way to look at that and argue whether the realist structure is more or less likely to suffer wars than and conflicts than the neorealist one. Those explanations to the long peace can be based not just on, of course, the behavior of the explanations based on some of the arguments offered by the neorealist approach, whether it is the pursuit of power or the pursuit of security. We can also look at one of the reasons that there was relatively long peace throughout the Cold War, for example. So no direct clashes between the superpowers because there was the rise of nuclear weapons. At the same time, during the Cold War, we had the growth in the power of international institutions such as the UN, led by the Security Council, which was able to alleviate some of the tensions and maybe prevent, again, those large wars between the superpowers. So there's additional explanations which can be part of the reasons that there was this long peace during the years of the Cold War. And again, long peace is defined in terms of no war between the United States and the Soviet Union. So it's not necessarily just the structural explanation of neorealism, but that's just an additional question. That's it for today. If you want to read a little bit more, these are a few relevant articles you can read about those two theoretical approaches. On Thursday, I will start by presenting another important, very important aspect of both realism, but more emphasized in the neorealism theory. And then we'll move to an additional material system-based theory of international relations for that week. That's it for today. Have a good rest of the day, and I will see you next time. Bye, everyone.